Imagine being let through a gate that is not the real gate. A servant bows, leads you across a courtyard, and at the far end stands a second wall, a second door, a second guard who has never once smiled at a stranger. This is what it meant to enter the home of a powerful family in ancient China during the final bloody century of the Warring States. The house in front of you was never just a house. It was an army without uniforms, a court without a throne, and sometimes a trap. Most people never imagined that the grandest private residences of this era were not measured by their gardens or their painted halls, but by how many strangers slept inside their walls every night. Behind the lacquered gates of 4 men in particular, men history remembers as the 4 lords of the Warring States, lived thousands of guests at once. Not servants, not soldiers. Guests, men who ate at their patron's table, slept in his corridors, and waited, sometimes for years, for the one moment when their strange and specific skill would matter more than gold. In this video, we go inside those homes. Not the architecture, not the gardens, not the fate of the families after the Qin conquest swallowed their world. This time we go through the actual front gate, into the daily and dangerous routine of housing thousands of armed, hungry, ambitious strangers under one roof, in the homes of Lord Mengchang of Qi, Lord Pingyuan of Zhao, Lord Xinling of Wei, and Lord Chunshen of Chu. These were the most powerful private homes the Warring States ever produced, and almost nobody outside China has ever heard what actually happened inside them. To the people living here, a household like this never slept. At Lord Mengchang's compound, first in the capital of Linzi, and later at his hereditary estate of Shui, in what is now Shandong province, the historian Sima Qian recorded that the number of resident guests reached 3,000. 3,000 mouths to feed every single day, with no modern bureaucracy, no spreadsheets, no standing army of clerks beyond what the Lord himself improvised. Picture the kitchens alone. Picture the grain stores, refilled constantly from estate taxes, never quite fast enough. Picture corridors lined at night with men who had nowhere else in the world to sleep, men who had fled debts, crimes, failed careers, or simply boredom, all gathered under one roof because one man had decided that talent, wherever it hid, was worth feeding. Sleep itself was a luxury earned by rank inside these walls. New arrivals often spent their first nights on borrowed mats in shared outer rooms, listening through thin partition walls to arguments between strategists debating a king's next move, or to a swordsman quietly sharpening a blade he hoped he would never need to use on a fellow guest. Nobody assigned permanent loyalty at the gate. It had to be earned slowly, meal by meal, season by season, until a guest's name was finally remembered by the Lord himself, rather than by a steward checking a tally of mouths to feed. Some men waited years for that single moment of recognition. Some never received it at all and simply vanished back into the roads they had come from, unrecorded by any historian, their one chance at relevance lost somewhere in a crowded corridor they shared with 3,000 strangers exactly like them. This part is rarely discussed, but the system had a name. These men were called Menke, dour guests, or Shaiki, eating guests. They were not nobility. They were wandering knights, failed scholars, disgraced officials, men who could mimic animal calls, men who could pick locks, men who could recite the precise wording of a forgotten treaty from 30 years earlier. A lord did not interview them with questions about their resume. He simply opened his gate and let them in, and waited to discover, often by accident, which one of them might someday save his life. Inside Lord Mengchang's compound, this open door was not an act of pure idealism. According to the records of the grand historian, he had also gathered roughly 60,000 households of wandering knights and fugitives from criminal charges within his fief of Shui alone. Men whose loyalty doubled as a private labor force and a private justice system beyond the reach of any king's magistrates. Taxes from these households fed the kitchens. Debts owed by local farmers, when collected, paid for grain and silk. The household was not only a court of talent, it was a small self-funding state stitched together from people the official world of Qi had already given up on. Most people never imagined that even inside one household, guests were not treated as equals. Mengchang's compound ran on a quiet, brutal hierarchy of comfort. The lowest-ranked guests ate plain vegetables and slept crowded together in shared rooms near the outer gate. Guests of middling rank were given fish with their rice. Only the most trusted, most useful retainers were granted a private carriage and horses to come and go as they pleased. Feng Xuan, in his first months as a nobody, tested this hierarchy openly. 3 separate times, he plucked the strings of his sword in the courtyard and sang a short, mocking complaint. First, that he had no fish to eat, then that he had no carriage to ride, and finally, that he had no means to support his elderly mother. Each time, the rest of the household rolled their eyes at his audacity. Each time, Mengchang quietly granted the request anyway, curious what kind of man complained so openly instead of simply leaving. It was this same difficult, unimpressive guest who would later burn the debt records at Xue and buy his lord a lifetime of loyalty no fortune could purchase outright. The arrangement worked, and it spread. By the late Warring States period, even Lu Buwei, the merchant who would rise to become Chancellor of Jin and patron of the boy who became Qin Shi Huang, felt the pressure of comparison. Ashamed that the most powerful state in the world had no household to rival the 4 lords, he assembled 3,000 retainers of his own inside Qin's capital, commissioning them to compile an enormous encyclopedia of statecraft, known as the Spring and Autumn Annals of Lu, simply so that Qin's own gate could be said to rival Linzi, Handan, Daliang, and Wu. Even the state that would eventually destroy every one of these households first had to imitate them. Few stories make that clearer than what happened to Lord Mengchang himself in the state of Qin. Around 299 BCE, he had traveled there at the invitation of the Qin king, who first wanted to make him chancellor, then changed his mind and placed him under house arrest instead, fearing his loyalty to Qi. Mengchang sent a desperate appeal to one of the king's concubines, who agreed to help only if he gave her a rare white fox fur robe, the very one he had already presented to the king as a gift, and which now sat locked inside the royal treasury. Mengchang had no second robe and no way to retrieve the first. But among his thousands of retainers was a man skilled at nothing more dignified than imitating animals. That night, disguised as a dog, the man slipped into the treasury and stole the robe back. The concubine kept her word. The king relented, but the danger was not over. The king soon regretted his mercy and sent riders after the fleeing household. Mengchang's party reached Hanggu Pass in the middle of the night, when the gates remained shut until dawn by law. Among his retainers was a second man, this one gifted at nothing more than crowing like a rooster. He crowed. The real roosters of the pass answered him, and the confused gatekeepers, believing morning had come, opened the gates early. Mengchang and his men rode through and escaped, just hours before the pursuers arrived. The 2 men whose only talents were barking like a dog and crowing like a rooster. The very retainers the rest of the household had mocked and looked down on had just saved every life inside that traveling household. After that night, nobody in Mengchang's home ever underestimated a guest again. The system worked because of a deeper, harder logic that the retainer Feng Xuan once explained to his lord without being asked. Feng Xuan had arrived destitute, owning nothing, and for a long time did nothing to distinguish himself except occasionally singing complaints to his sword at night. When Mengchang finally sent him to the estate at Shui to collect outstanding debts from the local farmers, Feng Xuan instead gathered everyone together, burned the debt records in front of them, and forgave every loan. Mengchang was furious until, years later, disgraced and stripped of his title in the capital, he found himself riding home to Shui with nowhere else to turn. 100 li from the town, the people of Shui lined the road, carrying their children, supporting their elders, to welcome him. Mengchang finally understood. Feng Xuan had not given away money. He had bought loyalty. the one currency that no enemy could ever seize from him. Feng Shuan, once Mengchang regained his ministry years later, offered one final piece of advice that became one of the most quoted lines in Chinese political language. He told his lord that a wise rabbit always digs 3 burrows before settling down, so that no single collapsed tunnel can trap it. Mengchang's true safety, he argued, depended on holding power in more than one place at once. His position in Qi, his fief at Shui, and the loyalty of neighboring states he had courted as a refuge of last resort. After his death, the proverb Jiao Tu San Ku, a crafty rabbit has 3 burrows, outlived every gate, every banquet hall, and every kitchen of his household, becoming ordinary spoken wisdom in Chinese for centuries afterward, still used today by people who have never heard of Lord Mengchang, his 3,000 guests, or the strange home that taught the lesson in the first place. The same culture took root, with its own local character, inside the home of Lord Pingyuan in Handan, the capital of Zhao. Pingyuan, born Zhao Sheng, son of the famous reform-minded King Wuling, kept a household just as crowded and just as exposed to its own private scandals. One of his concubines once laughed openly at a lame neighbor struggling across the courtyard below her balcony, and the man, deeply humiliated, came to Pingyuan's gate the next day to ask that she be punished. Pingyuan brushed it off as a trivial matter. Over the following months, retainer after retainer quietly packed up and left his household, until more than half were gone. When Pingyuan finally asked why, one of the remaining guests told him plainly, "Because you have not been willing to give up a woman's laughter for a man's dignity, your guests no longer believe you will protect them either." Pingyuan had the concubine executed and personally delivered her head to the lame man's door as an apology. After that, his departed retainers slowly began returning one by one. A household like this ran on reputation as much as on rice, and reputation, once cracked, had to be repaired in blood, or it would not be repaired at all. It was Pingyuan's household that produced one of the era's most famous tests of hidden talent. When Qin besieged Handan itself in 257 BCE, Pingyuan needed 20 sharp negotiators to travel to Chu and beg for military relief. He selected 19 easily from his 3,000 guests. For the 20th seat, a quiet retainer named Mao Sui stepped forward, a man who had lived in the household for 3 full years without once being noticed or promoted. Pingyuan mocked him, comparing a man with no visible talent to an arrow that, after 3 years in a quiver, should already have pierced through a sword sheath if it were sharp at all. Mao Sui replied that he was simply waiting to be placed in the quiver in the first place. He went to Chu, and when the king of Chu's own ministers failed for an entire morning to secure his support, Mao Sui climbed the steps uninvited, sword in hand, and argued Zhao's case so forcefully that the king agreed within minutes to send 100,000 soldiers. The household that fed 3,000 strangers for years, on the gamble that one of them might matter, had just been proven right again. Across the border in Wei, the household of Lord Xinling, born Wei Wuji, half-brother to the reigning king, told an even harder story about what these homes really cost. Among his 3,000 retainers was a 70-year-old gatekeeper named Hao Ying, a man so poor he still worked guarding the eastern Yi Gate of Daliang, the Wei capital near today's Kaifeng in Henan province. Even after Xinling had tried repeatedly to recruit him as an honored guest, Xinling once threw a grand banquet specifically to honor him, personally driving his own carriage to the gate to collect the old gatekeeper himself. Reserving the seat of highest honor at his own left hand, Hao Ying, testing the prince's patience, asked for an unplanned detour to visit an old friend, a butcher named Zhu Hai working anonymously in the markets, and deliberately lingered there in conversation while the prince waited outside, holding the reins himself, never once showing irritation in front of the gathered crowd of nobles already seated and waiting at his own table. It was a test of character disguised as rudeness, and Xinling passed it without knowing he had been examined at all. When Qin besieged Handan and Xinling's own brother-in-law Pingyuan begged for Wei's help, the king of Wei refused to act. Terrified of his half-brother's growing popularity, Xinling, desperate, turned to Hu Ying, who quietly suggested asking a royal concubine named Lady Ru for a favor she owed Xinling. Since years earlier he had avenged her father's murder, Lady Ru stole the king's half of the military tally, the bronze token without which no general would obey an order, from beside the sleeping king, and smuggled it to Xinling. But Ho Ying warned that the tally alone might not be enough. The general guarding the border, a loyal man named Jin Bi, might still refuse to hand over command on a stolen token's word. So, Ho Ying introduced Xinling to his old friend Zhu Hai, a butcher who had spent years working anonymously in the markets of Daliang precisely because, he said, nobody had ever recognized his worth. Zhu Hai agreed to accompany Xinling to the front. When Jin Bi hesitated and questioned the tally's legitimacy, Zhu Hai pulled out a weighted iron mallet hidden inside his robes and killed him on the spot. Xinling took command of the army, marched to Handan, and broke the Qin siege, saving an entire allied capital. Then, in the depths of that same household story, all three people who had made the rescue possible, Ho Ying, Lady Ru, and ultimately Zhu Hai, took their own lives in the aftermath, unwilling to live with the betrayal of their own king and master that the rescue had required. Xinling himself, unable to return home to face his brother's fury, lived in exile in Zhao for 10 years before quietly drinking himself to death back in Wei, mourned by ordinary citizens who remembered him long after the king who feared him was forgotten. This is where everything changes in the story of these homes. A household built to protect its lord, fed daily by thousands of loyal strangers, could just as easily become the very thing that destroyed him. Nowhere is that clearer than inside the household of Lord Chunshen of Chu, born Huang Xie, who eventually relocated his court from 12 counties north of the Huai River to the ancient city of Wu, in what is now Suzhou, Jiangsu province, before Chu's royal capital itself moved further east to Shuchun, near today's Shu County in Anhui. Chunshen, like the other three lords, kept more than 3,000 retainers, but power inside his gates had quietly slipped into the hands of one retainer in particular, a man named Li Yuan, who had offered his own younger sister to the childless king of Chu in the hope she might finally bear an heir. What followed inside Chunshen's residence was a slow, private catastrophe rarely shown in any documentary. As the king grew ill with no son to succeed him, another retainer named Zhu Ying warned Chunshen directly that Li Yuan, who had spent years secretly gathering his own private assassins under the cover of court business, intended to seize the palace the instant the king died, and would have no reason to spare the man who had helped place his sister at court in the first place. Zhu Ying begged for permission to kill Li Yuan first, offering to take the dangerous gatekeeping post that would let him strike the moment the king passed. Chunshen refused, certain that a man he had personally elevated could never turn against him. It is one of the strangest details preserved by Sima Qian that Zhu Ying, rebuffed, simply walked away from the household altogether rather than wait for the disaster he could already see coming, choosing his own survival over the loyalty that had bound every other guest inside that gate for 30 years. 17 days after the king's death, Li Yuan entered the palace gate first. His hidden men were waiting inside the Ji gate of Shuchun. When Lord Chunshen arrived, they killed him there at the threshold and threw his severed head back out through the gate to the street, before moving immediately on his family compound, killing every man, woman, and child of his household line. The household that had once sheltered 3,000 grateful strangers could not save the family that built it. What makes this final collapse harder to watch is how ordinary it must have felt only days earlier. Somewhere inside that same compound in Wu, later rebuilt by history into modern Suzhou, cooks were still stacking grain for the next morning's meals. Guests were still arguing in the courtyards about troop movements near the Huai River. Nobody inside those walls yet knew that the entire machinery of loyalty they depended on had already quietly failed. Weeks before the swords came out at the gate, history remembers these four men as the four lords of the warring states, celebrated for their generosity and feared for the private armies they assembled out of loyalty rather than blood. But the ordinary people who actually lived inside those gates, the cooks who never knew how many extra mouths they would feed by sunset, The guests who waited years in a corridor for one chance to matter. The gatekeepers who held a kingdom's fate without anyone noticing them for decades remembered something else entirely. They remembered a world where a home was never simply a home. It was a wager, made fresh every single day, that enough strangers treated with dignity might one day become the very hands that saved you. Or, just as easily, the very hands that ended you. What strikes a modern viewer most, looking back across more than 2,000 years, is how little of this had anything to do with armies or thrones in the way most history books frame the period. It happened inside dining halls, inside guest corridors, inside the small daily decisions about who ate fish and who ate vegetables, who was given a carriage and who was left waiting at the gate one season longer. Empires were shaken not by catapults alone, but by a man who knew how to bark like a dog, a butcher who had been overlooked for years, and a gatekeeper nobody thought to ask a single question. The people who built these households never knew they were creating one of the strangest political experiments in early Chinese history, the closest thing the era produced to private kingdoms without a throne. They only knew their gates needed feeding, their guests needed watching, and their own family's survival depended on guessing right about which stranger, out of 3,000, actually mattered. And if 4 noble households could hide an entire shadow government behind their walls, the next question is even harder to look away from. What happened when one single empire, ruled by one single family, tried to swallow every household like this whole, and turn every home in China into a piece of the same machine?